A next-gen console with just 4 teraflops of GPU power? Well, that's the rumour, isn't it? And actually, come to think of it, there's also this, the Zubor Z Plus, Zen 1 CPU technology, 4 teraflops of Vega GPU compute. Interesting machine, it looks like it's never coming out, but hey, maybe I should take a look at it at some point. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to be doing a bit of theory crafting on the supposed Xbox Series S, the lower-end Project Scarlet machine. It's also in development alongside the publicly revealed Series X. So yes, back at E3 2018, Xbox chief Phil Spencer talks about 2 Xboxes, or rather more than 1 Xbox being in development. But 1 year later, the focus shifted entirely to Series X and Series X only. However, the lower end machine, it's still very much in the offing, but whether we'll actually get to see it, well, I don't think any kind of decision's been taken there as of yet. But we have had some leaks on this machine, internally codenamed Lockhart, and here's what we know. First of all, it's very similar to the higher end Anaconda machine, the unit that's now known as Xbox Series X. So you're getting the same Zen 2 CPU architecture, 8 cores, 16 threads. There may be a slight clock speed difference on the CPU, but well, don't worry about that. Like Series X, it'll also be using PCI Express based NVMe solid state storage. I mean, the CPU and SSD are the key improvements for next gen, and the Lockhart design retains these aspects. Do expect a lower provision of memory though, and yes, a much less capable GPU. The design target has been 4 teraflops or thereabouts for some time now, which raises the question, in a world where Xbox One X hit the market with 6 teraflops back in 2017, how can a 4 teraflop machine possibly cut it for next gen? Well, I'm sure regular Digital Foundry viewers are ahead of the curve here. Gaming performance doesn't map in a linear fashion with teraflops. NVIDIA GPUs often ship with lower compute power than AMD equivalents, and yet they can run a lot faster. The next-gen consoles use a refined AMD architecture that gives you a ton more performance for your teraflop. So back in October last year, we put together an AMD build with ASUS that had 9.2 teraflops of GPU power and found that, well, effectively, you can double Xbox One X's performance. So with that knowledge in our back pocket, let's shift the focus to a potential, and I stress that, potential 4 teraflop Navi machine. For test purposes, I put together a machine very similar to the one that ASUS constructed for us last year. Ryzen 7 3700X powers this unit, and for reasons, I've locked all cores to 3.5 GHz. 16 gigs of system RAM, and our primary GPU here is the new low-end 8GB version of the RX 5500 XT. Well, I say low-end because, as we shall discover, well, when you look at the stats, it's not bad actually. The GPU itself features a total of 24 compute units, 22 active. Game clock 1717 MHz, meaning that your in-game performance rated at about 4.8 teraflops. So I downclocked this to run at about 1550 MHz, giving us 4.3 teraflops, closer to the mooted design target. Now, I would expect an actual Scarlet machine to ship with fewer compute units but higher clocks, and I would expect that to be more performant than the setup I've got here. And that's kind of why I've bumped up clocks just a little bit to give us 4.3 teraflops instead of 4.0. You see, the problem is that we've got to downclock here, and when that happens, it affects all parts of the GPU, not just compute. Memory interface, 128 bits on the 5500 XT, 224 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. And yeah, my gut feeling here is that a lower end Scarlet machine would likely run 12 gigs over 192 bits. So yeah, not an exact match there, but we'll talk about that in a bit. As you can see then, the GPU itself, absolutely tiny, just 158 square millimeters. Even if we add in the Zen 2 CPU component, we'd still be looking at a really small processor in a prospective Lockhart console. Small is cheap. Small means that we could actually have a decently priced, value-conscious next-gen console that runs all of the same games as the Series X. But the key question is power, right? So let's cut straight to the chase. How does it compare to Xbox One X? Well, we've got some nice ballpark figures to consider here, but please do bear in mind that once we move into a new console generation, the GPU will be used in different ways than it is now. Developers will gradually get more from the kit they're given. I mean, effectively, you've got something magnificent looking like Gears 5 here, running on what you would consider to be a downclocked version of the Radeon HD 7790, and that was a lower end GPU way back in March 2013. So yeah, the concept that that level of GPU power can produce this, I actually find that quite remarkable. Bottom line, trust the developers when it comes to getting the most out of the hardware that they're given. So yes, please treat these renderings for what they are, an attempt to measure like-for-like workloads on the GPU. Nothing more, not any kind of statement on next-gen power, okay? Right, so with that in mind, Developer.io Interactive told us what PC equivalent settings the Xbox One X version of Hitman 2 runs at. And by choosing a GPU bound situation like this level here, we can compare our 5500 XT with its custom settings to the power of the Scorpio engine in the Xbox One X. And hey, check that out, we're not actually that far behind. The Xbox One X takes a lead across the entire test for around 6.5%. But factor in stuff like limited memory bandwidth and the fact that our 5500 XT is running at pretty low clocks, well, I think that right away we've established that a circa 4 teraflop next-gen GPU with the Navi architecture can deliver broadly equivalent power to the Xbox One X. And we have similarly equivalent settings for Wolfenstein, the new Colossus here, where the medium preset on PC is effectively the console experience. Here, the Xbox One X at 4K is delivering around an 8% advantage over our underclocked 5500 XT. Bottom line though, we are in the ballpark. So do these console versus PC comparisons actually hold any water? Well, consoles are really very close to PCs in many ways. If you can match settings on PC to the console quality level, well, effectively the only thing getting in the way of a meaningful benchmark is likely to be something like GPU compiler efficiency, where yes, the consoles will have an advantage. But this concept of Navi's increased performance versus older architectures, teraflop for teraflop, and whether a 4 teraflop Navi can match 6 teraflops of older GCN, well, this is something that we can also test in another way, something that's a bit more accurate. This is the Radeon RX 590. Lock it to 1310 MHz and you have a 6 teraflop GCN GPU. For my tests, I also overclocked the memory to 288 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. And this? Well, this is a bit of a relic, but a piece of technology I'm growing rather fond of. It's the R9 390, the MSI variant, the classic Hawaii chip. 40 compute units here, just like Xbox One X. And while it probably hates my guts for doing it, I overvolted it and overclocked it to 1172 MHz to match Xbox One X clock for clock. 6 teraflops and a frankly hilarious 512-bit memory interface for 384 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. So yeah, bear in mind my 5500 XT's tiny 128-bit interface when looking at these benches. And yeah, I honestly believe that that interface may well be significantly wider in an actual Lockhart console. So my understanding is that Series X has a 4K 60 design target for games, while Lockhart 1440p 60 target. 12 teraflops versus 4 teraflops. But also remember that game developers are free to use that power as they wish, and also that Microsoft is happy to call a 4K game with dynamic resolution scaling a 4K game. So I'd imagine it's the same for 1440p too. Let's see what our 5500 XT could actually do then. And I'm not going to go easy on it either, kicking off with a game with a reputation rightly earned for monstering any and all PC hardware, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, we're running at the highest settings here, which brings it into line with the visual feature set of the Xbox One X version. At 1080p, average frame rate is indeed 60 frames per second, but obviously it can drop lower. My gut feeling here is that we're likely hitting CPU issues. I honestly think the GPU could likely pull this one off. Fascinatingly, the 5500 XT is faster at 1080p and 1440p than either the downclocked 590 or the overclocked 390. An experience in line with Xbox One X or a 1080p 60 version of the game leveraging the Zen 2 cores. It's not bad at all. Now let's look at some resolution scaling. Dropping from 4K to 1440p, you gain a whopping great 78% of performance. And yeah, moving from 1440p to 1080p, a 36% jump. 1440p may well be the sweet spot in pixel pushing terms, but the option to run this at 60 FPS likely more compelling. Resolution scaling, yeah, it's the same story in Hitman 2, uncannily so. Performance increases by 79%, dropping from 4K to 1440p, and you'll get a 39% bump moving from 1440p to 1080p. Of course, Hitman actually went for 1440p for its performance mode on Xbox One X, and when you look at the benchmark here, it's easy to see why. Our average frame rate across the board at 1440p, 58 frames per second. And if we bring in our other AMD 6 teraflop rivals, again, the 5500 XT is ahead despite its apparently big compute deficit. Interestingly, at 1440p and 4K, the old 390 beats the 590 performance-wise, which I find quite amusing. I'm going to assume it's absolutely soaking bandwidth there. But then again, remember that our 5500 XT actually has a much higher bandwidth limitation. Fascinating results then. And look, here's what I find really cool. Forget about the teraflops for a moment and check this out. The 5500 XT, a 158 square millimeter processor, 22 active compute units, 128-bit bus. The 590, 232 square millimeters, 36 compute units, 256-bit bus. Yes, I'm underclocking it, but it's only a fraction slower than an RX 580. And yeah, the overclocked R9 390, 438 square millimeters, 40 compute units, 512-bit memory interface. The efficiency gains over time here, quite remarkable. And yeah, remember the 5500 XT has been significantly downclocked. It's 36% of the size of the 390 and its memory interface is tiny by comparison, but even so it's faster. That's progress and it's awesome, but yeah, not everything is faster, let's be clear. A look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p shows the downclocked 5500 XT start to lag a little behind its 6 teraflop counterparts, 5% slower. And the resolution scaling is very different to the previous games as well. The 78-79% gain we saw in other titles dropping from 4K to 1440p is now a big 91%, almost a doubling of performance. 1440p to 1080p, 54%, again much larger than our previous tests. Memory bandwidth considerations perhaps? I think what's also intriguing here is that we've done a pretty good job of matching console settings, but none of our test GPUs here got anywhere close to the performance of the Xbox One X in its 4K quality mode. So yeah, this one is a bit of a mystery then. Now, it wouldn't be a Digital Foundry video with benchmarks in it if we didn't shoehorn in Crysis somehow. So here we are with, yes, of course, my favorite, Crysis 3. I'm running with everything maxed here except shading and shadows, which are dropped down a notch to high. You actually save a ton of performance with these simple tweaks and don't really lose much in terms of visual features. Similar story to Shadow. Here, you more than double performance by dropping from 4K to 1440p, and you gain 57% in frame rate overall by lowering from 1440p to 1080p. But this is a demanding game, yet still the older GCN cards at 6 teraflops are 7 to 10% faster at 1440p. And if you really want to get concerned about the Navi architecture, at least in my controlled conditions here, check out the latest Remedy masterpiece, Control. Right, so I'm benching cutscenes here, which are a ton more impactful on performance than actual gameplay, but this is all about the relative differentials. Now, remember, this is a demanding game. It runs at 1440p on Xbox One X after all. I'm using as close to console quality settings as we could ascertain, which is essentially medium across the board. But it really doesn't look good for our 5500 XT. This is the weakest performer of the bunch. The 590 and even 390 at 6 teraflops, around 17% faster. This is one game that makes me curious about the whole exercise really. We've conclusively proved elsewhere that teraflops don't matter so much, and yet with Control, it does seem to be the case that the extra horsepower can make a difference. What I will say though is that the resolution scaling metrics on the 5500 XT quite astonishing. A 118% gain in performance dropping to 1440p from 4K, then a further 64% adjusting from 1440p to 1080p. Crikey! Right, so one thing I do want to point out is that while a 4 or 4.3 teraflop versus 6 teraflop battle is the order of the day here, perhaps it's not quite a level playing field. Memory bandwidth is massively different between the three of them, and I think this does play a key role in performance. Now, I didn't equalize them here because that bandwidth, it would have been factored into the original design. In fact, I actually overclocked the 590's RAM to 288 gigabytes per second, because my gut feeling is that this might match the throughput of Lockhart if Microsoft decided to go with a 192-bit interface. But let's stick with control here. Level out the bandwidth and see what happens. Now, unfortunately, the R9390 crashes if you underclock the RAM so severely. But it's no problem at all for the RX 590, dropping back to 224 gigabytes per second to match the 5500 XT. Lose about 7% of performance, but the Navi card still much slower. Our 590 here has an 8% advantage, so that's matched compute and memory bandwidth, as like for like as we're going to get. While the difference is still clearly noticeable, the gap has closed up. Unfortunately, the 5500 XT's memory overclocking capabilities are pretty much non-existent, so there's little we can do to see how memory bandwidth improvements would improve the situation on our Navi card here. Let's move on to some takeaways from our testing then. Can a 4 teraflop GPU power a next-gen console? Well, I think by and large we have proven that you'll get Xbox One X level performance or something in that ballpark. I mean, even Control could do 1440p 30 on the downclocked 5500 XT. But here's the thing, Xbox One X saw its GPU performance rooted into outputting vast pixel counts, simply for the most part because the CPU was the limiting factor, getting in the way of lower resolution but higher frame rate gaming. And that's something that's not going to be an issue with a cheaper Lockhart next-gen Xbox. So with that in mind, I would expect to see a lot of 1080p and dynamic 1440p patches, taking a lot of existing Xbox games up to 60 frames per second. I think that could be pretty awesome. In fact, if you look at Wolfenstein, the new Colossus, it looks to me like Lockhart could conceivably stand a chance of hitting 1080p at 120 frames per second. As to how things will stack up against more powerful next-gen machines like PS5 or the Series X, well, really this is all about scalability, and forgive me for this, but this requires another look at the data from a different perspective. Let's go back to our Hitman Navi versus console benchmark, but this time let's factor in our October 2019 data where we had that Asus 9.2 teraflop Navi machine. A couple of months after I posted that, coincidentally, an AMD test leak strongly suggested that PS5 Silicon was being tested with 9.2 teraflops of compute. Quite the coincidence then, so this comparison, kind of interesting I'd say. The faster Navi card, 80% faster than Xbox One X and 92% faster than our 5500 XT. So when we consider that the Series X may well be even more powerful than this, the gap will be even wider. Pretty much identical scaling on Wolfenstein actually. 80% faster than Xbox One X, 92% faster than our 5500 XT. We'll stress again though that we are in theory crafting territory here. We don't have actual Lockhart specs. But the Xbox engineers know what they're doing. They'll know how to get more out of this silicon, whether it's through increased memory bandwidth or whatever. And really, as I said, it's all about scalability, isn't it? Scalability and strategy. If the design target is 4K on a more expensive machine and 1440p on the cheaper one, well, let's see what the data tells us. Got some intriguing results here on Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So if you compare our 4.3 teraflop Navi to a 9.2 teraflop equivalent, 1440p performance is only 6% off pace. Meanwhile, at 1080p, the less capable 4.3 teraflop Navi GPU is 28% faster than the 9.2 teraflop equivalent running at 4K. Crysis 3, now this one was a bit troublesome in our prior tests, but check this out. At 1440p, our low power Navi is actually 5% faster than the 9.2 teraflop equivalent, a lead that stretches out to a gargantuan 64% at 1080p. Hitman actually operates more in line with AC Odyssey. 1440p at 4.3 teraflops is, well, a bit off the pace. 9.2 teraflop Navi, 7% faster. But again, 1080p versus 4K, now we've got a 30% advantage. Scalability results from Shadow of the Tomb Raider are even more fascinating. 4K 9.2 teraflop GPU, 7% faster than our 1440p low power Navi. But 1080p from our tuned 5500 XT, 43% faster than 4K on the higher end card. Wolfenstein, well, here's the tweaked 5500 at 1440p and it's 5% faster with a colossal 62% lead at 1080p. And yeah, we'll finish off with Control. Here the 4.3 teraflop Navi, the 5500 XT at 1440p, it's absolutely level across the benchmark with our 5700 XT tuned to 9.2 teraflops. And yeah, Control on the lower end GPU, 66% faster at 1080p versus 5700 XT at 4K. Now I'm finding all of this fascinating because if the entry-level next-gen Xbox is all about scaling down higher resolution experiences, I think the data here, while varying significantly from game to game, well, it demonstrates that there's ample scope here for similar workloads to scale effectively. But of course, if the Series X is delivering a full-on 12 teraflops, well then the calculus does change. Resolution may need to be closer to 1080p than it is to 1440p to get an equivalent experience. And that's something I can't really test because, well, if Series X does indeed deliver that vast level of GPU power, there isn't actually a Navi card on the PC market right now capable of matching it. Best I could do was to get the 5700 XT pushed up to 2 GHz, 40 compute units for 10.2 teraflops of compute. And well, that 11% extra of throughput gets you 6.5% of extra performance here in Control. And well, beyond that though, there's not really much more I can add. I can't verify that 4 teraflops of Navi power can deliver a 1440p equivalent to 12 teraflops at 4K. Seems unlikely, but some kind of middle ground between 1440p and 1080 certainly looks a lot more doable. And yes, this is all before we factor in the next generation of image reconstruction techniques that make native resolution less of a big deal now than it has been previously. And yeah, curiously, a while back, Playground Games, now a first-party Microsoft studio, they made public some of its work on machine learning-based upscaling using Forza Horizon 3 as a base. The foundation of this, DirectML, the machine learning API Microsoft is developing for DX12, almost certain to play some kind of role in the next-gen Xbox machines. And yeah, as fun as these in-theory projects are for me to work on, let's sort of get real here. We can only model approximations of next-gen GPUs based on what might be considered outdated workloads. And yeah, the actual configuration of these GPUs will be tuned by Microsoft for increased performance. They may even have a fair amount of RDNA 2.0 engineering work included too, something that isn't present in the graphics cards I used for these experiments. You know, when the Lockhart 4 teraflop leak emerged, I was skeptical. I think a lot of people were. But look, we have Sony telling investors that fixing a price for PS5 is a bit of a challenge right now. And that says to me that, well, maybe a lower power machine makes sense in a world where the cost of making gaming hardware simply isn't that cheap anymore, something that's been a recurring theme in Digital Foundry coverage ever since we first revealed Xbox One X. So in that sense, a scaled back option, potentially scaling back on resolution only, well, this kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And our numbers suggest that there's a window of scalability here that could work, even based on the ludicrously small amount of information we have about the makeup of the next-gen boxes. But on the flip side, well, I can't see it making life easier for developers as such, having to develop for two specific SKUs. But, you know, maybe Microsoft has some tricks up its sleeve there as well. I'll also be interested to see how features like hardware-accelerated ray tracing would factor into a lower power box. I guess I'll close by saying that, of course, while Microsoft may have hinted at more than one Xbox being in development and the fact that Lockhart as a project is a thing, it's not actually going to be real until it's announced. If PlayStation 5 is cheaper than expected, maybe it could squeeze Lockhart out of contention. And no announcement as of yet means it never needs to come to market if it's not required. If a machine that's twice as powerful is only $100 or $150 more expensive, got to ask what the point is, right? Then again, the reason Lockhart is in development in the first place, it kind of suggests that Microsoft possibly thinks that next gen may well be too expensive for the mainstream. And the recent Bloomberg story on Sony's pricing worries, well, maybe they're onto something here. Right then, I'm going to sign off for now. Like, subscribe, share. Do this if you feel so inclined. It really does help out the channel. And so does clicking that little bell icon actually, which bestows upon you great fortune, or at least the prospect of instant notifications whenever we post new content onto YouTube. And yes, if you love what we do, if you want the best quality video presentation possible, and if you want to support myself, John, Tom and Alex more directly in producing this kind of work, well, the DF Patreon is crucial in helping Digital Foundry to do what it does. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, if indeed you did, and just generally, thanks for watching.